This storm is coming like a ghost town. All the clubs are being closed down. This place is coming like a ghost town. Bands won't play no more. Too much fighting on the dance floor.
Okay, so I've unmuted myself. Hello, everybody. Hello there. Hi, welcome to the Bookmarks live event for the book From Bobby to Babylon, Blacks and the British Police. My name is Olai Todibi, or you can call me Ola. I'm going to be the host for this evening's event. And I'm just going to be introducing the speakers today. We have Brian and Layla. Now, Brian Richardson is a criminal barrister. He's written the introduction of the book for the 2020 edition. He is known as an editor, an author, and he claims to be a leading figure in stand-up to racism. The second speaker we have today is Layla Hassan, who was one of the founding members of the publishing collective Race Today. She took over as editor from the late Darcus Howe, in which she and Howe were in the publication, wrote and intervened in the struggles in the 1970s and 80s. It's amazing we have a beautiful day today, and the speakers are going to be speaking for 10 to 15 minutes each. Afterwards, the floor will be open for participants to ask questions or provide additional points if they'd like to. And yeah, I'd just like to thank everybody for turning up, and on to Brian. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Ola. Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Dave and Josh and everyone at Bookmarks for putting on this event. And thank you to everyone who's logged in or signed on, or whatever the phrase is, for giving up at least part of your Friday to spend some of the evening with us. Of course, we're all living in very strange times, probably the strangest that any of us have lived through. So instead of being in a room together, we're scattered far and wide. I believe Dave is actually not even necessarily over here. So wherever you are, I hope you're all safe and well. We began the meeting, I hope you were here in time to hear us listening to the legendary song Ghost Town by The Specials. Now, I'm sure that you feel as I do when I walk around my home territory in my allotted period of exercise each day, that it does feel like something of a ghost town compared to the usual hustle and bustle that we're all used to. But there was another reason for playing it, not just because of the strange times that we're living in. It is 39 years ago this month, Layla might be able to correct me if I'm wrong, but it's 39 years ago this month that the very same streets in Brixton that I walk around on those daily periods of exercise erupted in protest against police brutality. 3 months later, we witnessed similar explosions across the country in 35 different towns and cities, most notably in Liverpool, in Birmingham, in Leeds, the Moss Side district of Manchester, as well as once again in London. And in the very same week that those riots erupted across the country, that very same brilliant, haunting single that we listened to, Ghost Town by The Specials, was #1 in the chart. So that's another poignant reason for listening to that record. That year, 1981, also saw the New Cross fire, about which I'm sure Layla will tell you more, and the case of the Bradford 12, a group of Asian youth who sought to defend their community from the threat of fascists. It was events like those that provided the starting point and the context for the series of articles written by Darcus Howe, which are collected in and are the content of this book, From Bobby to Babylon. You may be wondering about the title, so let me explain it. In short, it encapsulates the dramatic change in perceptions and understanding about the role of the police and the behaviour of the constabulary within Britain's black communities. From the 1950s onwards, the popular image really of the police was that of the kindly Constable George Dixon, characterised in the long-running BBC television series Dixon of Dock Green. He was a very nice neighborhood police officer who seemed able to solve everyone's problems and end with a nice cup of tea and a nice chat. The police were also affectionately known as Bobbies, hence the title, a reference to their founder, the 19th century Home Secretary and later Prime Minister, Sir Robert Peel. By the time that Darcus wrote these particular articles, the harsh realities of their interactions with the police had led Britain's black communities to classify them in more sinister terms. The term Babylon was a word widely used by the increasingly influential and growing population of Rastafarians, and it was adopted by black youth to classify their oppressors, hence the title From Bobby to Babylon. Now, Darcus wasn't simply commentating on these matters, but he was also speaking from personal experience. He himself came to Britain from Trinidad in 1961, and once here, he hung out with, amongst others, and helped his friend, the fellow Trinidadian Frank Critchlow. Frank was the proprietor of two restaurants in West London, firstly El Rio, and then from 1968 onwards, the Mangrove in All Saints Road in Notting Hill. These were places where black and white people mixed easily and comfortably. The BBC, for example, had recently relocated to White City, just down the road. And so this was a place where middle-class whites, socialites, and one or two notorious politicians, some of you may have seen at the beginning of the year, the dramatisation of the Profumo scandal, for example. These were places where people of different communities met, socialized, relaxed, and enjoyed the vibe. So not surprisingly, they didn't meet with the approval of the police, and neither did the presence of so-called hustlers, young, unemployed youth. So the police always treated Mangrove with hostility and suspicion, constantly looking for some reason to shut it down, to prosecute its owners and the activists who frequented it. The premises were raided 12 times between January 1969 and July 1970, and the rationale for this was that it was supposedly a drugs den, despite the fact that no drugs was ever found on the property and no evidence of such activities was ever found. Nevertheless, the police were absolutely determined to nail Frank Critchlow, and so they instead ended up pursuing him for a series of petty infringements like licensing irregularities, allowing dancing and providing food and tea, and I mean tea, after 11 p.m. Darcus had worked at Mangrove, but he'd been back in Trinidad for a period of time, participating in the Black Power Rebellion in the island of his birth at the time that this harassment began. When he returned to London, he spoke to Frank, and Frank told him about this particular turn of events. And at that time, Darcus was a member of the British Black Panthers, inspired by the ideas of the Black Panther Party in the United States. And he suggested that they organise a demonstration. Demonstration took place on the 9th of August 1970, and it was, to be honest, a relatively modest affair, perhaps 150 people participating. They were confronted by 700 police officers who waded into the crowd and arrested 19 of the participants. 9 of them, including Frank Critchlow and Darcus, were subsequently prosecuted for a variety of offences, including conspiracy to incite a riot, a fray, and the usual one of assaulting police officers. They became known as the Mangrove Nine, and their subsequent trial is rightly recognised as one of the great episodes in recent British legal history. Like his uncle, the great Marxist historian C.L.R. James, Darcus was educated at Trinidad's most prestigious institution, the Queen's Royal College. He also had a grounding in law from a period of study at the Middle Temple here in London, and so he was certainly somebody who could talk the talk. But instead of relying, therefore, on barristers to represent him, he and one of his fellow defendants, Althea Lecointe, decided to conduct their own defence at the trial. And they worked in collaboration with the defendant's other lawyers, including one or two of the finest barristers of their generation, one of whom, Ian MacDonald, sadly died earlier this year, just at the time, actually, that this publication was being produced. The trial also demonstrated that Darcus could walk the walk. He was somebody who passionately believed in the oppressed and exploited doing things for themselves rather than things being done on their behalf by educated representatives. And as Darcus documents in this publication, in the essay Cause for Concern in the Public Eye, one of the key tactics of the defendants was to demand an all-black jury. We want a jury of our peers. And therefore, that was what the law said, that was what they wanted. And their tenacity is highlighted by the fact that they argued that particular legal point for 2 days, 2 whole days. Now, the court ruled against them, but they did succeed in putting the prosecution on the defensive and highlighting the political nature of the police attack upon them. Eventually, they were able to dismiss something like 63 of the prospective jurors and ensure that there were at least 2 black people on the jury. The trial itself took place at the Old Bailey in late 1971. It lasted for 55 days, and the police evidence being centred around, and I quote, accusations that Mangrove was a haunt for criminals, prostitutes and ponces. It was a desperate case, and at the end, all 9 of them were acquitted of riot. 5 of them, including both Frank Critchlow and Darcus, were acquitted of all other charges. An absolutely tremendous victory. But Mangrove didn't prove to be the last time that Darcus felt the long arm of the law. He was arrested 6 times whilst he was editor of Race Today, and on 5 of the occasions he was acquitted of all charges. I'm sure Layla will talk to you about this, but when he was sent to prison for assault for 3 months in 1977, an international campaign ensured that he was released within a week. Now, we haven't just republished this book for nostalgic reasons. It has been out of print for far too long, and consequently, far too few people, particularly those from younger generations, will have had an opportunity to read it and learn the lessons that it tells. So I think it's worthwhile for that reason alone. We're delighted that it's being republished. But I would add that although the articles collected here were written in, I think, between 1980 and 1982, the collection itself was first published in 1988, and they retained at that time contemporary relevance, because in an era where Margaret Thatcher's government was known for its brutality, it was not surprising that we continue to feel the oppressive weight of the police, and that the riots also erupted in places like Brixton in 1985. A great deal has happened since then. One of the most significant, of course, was the murder of Stephen Lawrence, which many of us marked yesterday, the 27th anniversary of. Now, in the aftermath of the report that bears Stephen's name, the judge finally, Sir William Macpherson, acknowledged the existence of institutional racism in British society. That was in 1999. Now, there's a great deal that's wrong with the definition that Sir William Macpherson came up with, but nonetheless, his recognition of institutional racism was a huge step forward from the conclusions of another judge, Lord Leslie Scarman, who reported into the 1981 Brixton riots. And Darcus dissects and destroys Scarman's report in the chapter in this collection, Scarman Failing to Grasp the Nettle. When the Stephen Lawrence inquiry report was finally presented to Parliament, the Home Office minister who commissioned it, Jack Straw, promised it would lead to a step change in society's attitudes to race relations. He accepted all of its recommendations. He introduced an act, the Race Relations Amendment Act in 2000, and he set up a monitoring group which included Stephen's parents, supposedly to monitor progress. A generation later, politicians, pundits, and the press were adamant in their assertion that institutional racism is no longer relevant, it's outdated, and so on. I think we know from our own experience, I know from my experience as a barrister practicing at the criminal bar, that the disproportionate charging, the disproportionate stops and searches, the charges, the disproportionate sentences that Black and minority ethnic defendants experience if we're convicted of crimes is an indication that institutional racism is very much alive and kicking. And that was further confirmed in a report that was written by David Lammy, then a backbench Labour MP, now the Shadow Justice Secretary in the Labour shadow government. I'm being asked to wind up, so let me just finish by coming back to today. Of course, it remains to be seen what the impact of COVID-19 will have on all of our communities, but it's already becoming clear, isn't it, that Black and minority ethnic communities are disproportionately affected, disproportionately falling critically ill and dying. We know from bitter experience as well that an increase in police powers, if they become entrenched as a result of COVID-19, will have an impact on our communities. When I went for one of my recent walks down to Windrush Square in Brixton, it was no surprise to me that within minutes, police vans had turned up to move on for loitering too long. The handful of overwhelmingly poor Black people who had congregated in the square. Let me kind of finish, therefore, by saying Darcus was somebody who, I only met Darcus a handful of times, but I know that were he alive today, he would have sought to, not just to stand on the sidelines, but to intervene in the debates that are taking place today. I'd advise you, I'd encourage you to go onto YouTube and have a look at the interaction between Darcus and the hapless BBC news reporter Fiona Armstrong in the aftermath of the 2011 riots, when politicians of every stripe were condemning the riots. Darcus stood firm in defending both the family of Mark Duggan, the man who was killed, and the communities who erupted at that time. Somebody who walked the walk and talked the talk. And of course, Darcus could be fiercely critical of everybody, including those who were his allies. But one thing that was absolutely always the case was that he believed in unity. He certainly believed in Black and white unity in struggle against our oppressors and exploiters. I'm going to finish by paying tribute to Layla, who you're going to hear from after I shut up. Layla was, of course, a member, as Ola has said, of the Race Today Collective and took over from Darcus as editor in 1985. That collective was born out of a determination to record and recognise the struggles that were taking place against racism in the community and to be a vehicle for the mobilisation of that community. The publication of this book, From Bobby to Babylon, follows on from the publication by Pluto Press last autumn of the Race Today anthology, Here Today, Here to Fight, and it's very much a complementary publication to that earlier book. The publication of both of these books is, I would argue, a reflection of Layla's commitment and the commitment of the Race Today collective to offer their wealth of knowledge and experience to a new generation in the hope and expectation that they will continue the fight that collective did so much to organise and promote. And we are going to need that level of mobilisation and organisation. It's for those reasons, therefore, that it's a real privilege that Layla has trusted us with producing the update of From Bobby to Babylon, and it's an honour to share a platform with her. Thank you very much.
Wow, thank you very much, Brian, for that very moving account of, you know, a racial struggle in very recent history. Yeah, thank you very much for that. I'd just like to remind everybody who's watching, because we have a few more people watching that after Layla has spoken, our next speaker has spoken, you can contribute questions or other contributions later within the live stream. If our next speaker here, Layla Hassan, let me just reintroduce her again because I understand that there's a few more people here. So she is one of the founding members of the publication Race Today, with the late Darcus Howe. She then took over as editor in 1985. The publication Race Today is responsible for writing and intervening in racial struggle in the 70s and 80s. Okay, so now we're just going to introduce Layla Hassan. Layla, take it away.
Myself. Hi, everybody. Thank you for attending this live stream. It's the first one I've ever done, so please forgive me if there's any stuttering and stammering along the way. Very pleased. At first I thought, probably 10 people would join, but they're informing me on the screen that there's over 50 people here, so I've now got more nervous. So Bobby to Babylon. This continues the work of the Legacy Group, some of whom are members of Race Today, members of Darcus's family, and the authors of Darcus's biography, and some academics and friends of Darcus. And we've had this group now since Darcus died. And Bobby to Babylon, as Brian has said, is part of our kind of way of continuing that new generation should learn about Darcus and know about his contribution to British society, as well as to the struggle of Black people in Britain. I need to thank Bookmarks for publishing the book. And it's 33 years since it was first published. And it's really part of us letting people know about a kind of radical contemporary Black history. This is a history that hasn't been told. It's a history which has been hidden. And with Darcus's death, we've been able to resurrect this. And when I've been speaking to people to different events across the country, of course, I realize that this history just isn't known and people are very hungry to know about it. So thank you for Bookmarks for doing this. So this book was originally published by The Collective. It was a group of young people, 15 of us, sometimes more as people were attracted to our work. And we came from the Caribbean, and Africa, and some of us were born in Britain. We were based in Britain and we were a radical collective. We were part of the struggle that was going on for Black rights in Britain, that was being really led by the second generation, as they say, of immigrants to this country. Darcus, a Jamesian, as Brian has already pointed out, decided he would build a small organization around a magazine. And I think that's what people need to understand. He never had the intention of building some huge, massive organization and being the leader of it. He was very clear he was going to build a small organization of activists around a publication. And we know now, looking back, that the impact Race Today had at that time was a small organization in Brixton that had national and international impact. We produced the magazine, first of all monthly and then bi-monthly, and we produced small pamphlets, small booklets for people, of which Bobby to Babylon was one. And in this, we recorded and we analysed the different movements for change that we were part of. And these movements were against the police brutality on the factory floor, in education and in housing. And we did this for over 14 years. And now when I speak to people, there's an amazement that a group of us could stay together for 14 years. And I'm not saying that staying together was easy, but stay together we did. And now some 30 to 40 years onwards, we realize how important the recording of these struggles is, and hopefully in the new digital age, we'll be able to take advantage of that and get this out to more people. So Bobby to Babylon is informed by countless rebellions and campaigns against the police in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. It's over 4 decades that Darcus records from Bobby to the view that the British policeman was the best in the world, the friendly copper who would always, have a chat, to the Babylon, to the person who was willingly brutalizing and beating up Black people across the land. And reading it again, I have to say the words of Linton in the introduction to the book, I have to say, because it really sums up Darcus's writing. He calls it analytical, combative, empirical, and always mindful of historical context. And as I say, that's a feature of anything that Darcus wrote. It's really hard to realize that what we've lost when you read books like this and you see the depth and the range of things that informed Darcus for the content that he then produced. As Brian has said, Darcus came here in 1961. He was 18, and he witnessed at first hand the arrogance in which the British police force were harassing and framing the newly arrived immigrant population. And in this book, he outlines the early struggles of the 60s. And in the chapter, A Whisper in the Ear of Authority, he recalls those early days. Now, the organizations in those early days were the Campaign Against Racial Discrimination, which was a group of sort of what we would consider do-gooders, church people, academics, intellectuals, social workers, and they formed something called the Campaign Against Racial Discrimination, of which somebody called Lord David Pitt was at the helm. And then there was the West Indian Standing Conference, which was led by a man called Joe Hunt. And I'm just going to read from the book because it's a book launch, and I think it's important that you get a flavor of some of the stuff that's in the book. So I'm going to read on the chapter. Darcus calls this the whisper, the early years, whispering in the ear of authority. And what he's outlining here is that because we didn't have the conference to directly challenge what the police were doing, organizations like the West Indian Standing Conference would go to people in authority and whisper to them about the oppression and what was taking place. But after a while, they realized this wasn't working. And I'm going to use a word which some people might take offense of. But in 1966, a report was issued by the West Indian Standing Conference called Nigger Hunting in England. And this is what they said. It has been confirmed that sergeants and constables do leave stations with the express purpose of going nigger hunting. That is to say, they do not get orders to act in this way, but amongst themselves, they decide to bring in a colored person at all cost. And the Standing Conference, as I say, was a very democratic, liberal organization. And this was the report that they put forward. The difficulty to apprehend the policemen who indulge in these hunts lies in the fact that most of them go out in plain clothes. They use their own cars, and in many instances, persons who are threatened and assaulted cannot get their numbers, even when a colored man attempts to take a policeman's number. He is apprehended for obstruction. So he's outlining the fact that what we know is that they would go out, just willy-nilly pick on people, arrest them, beat them up, and then charge them. And they produced this report in order to highlight to the government, so everything then was facing the government and facing authority, to say that this should not go on and that this could not go on. And Darcus in his book also talks about, puts in an interview with an ex-policeman, which I want to read because it really gives us a taste of an era. And the reason I do this, because I think it's important to realize how far we have come. I know now people talk a lot about what's going on and how difficult things are, but when you read Bobby to Babylon and the span it has over the 4 decades, you just see the progress that we have made and how far we have come. So this is part of the interview. The policeman. Well, I think in the police force, you find a complex of prejudiced minorities. For example, you might find a certain number of police officers would be prejudiced against taxi drivers, bus drivers, or against Jewish people. But I think that color prejudice is virtually absolute. In other words, it extends probably 99%. So the interviewer says, what efforts were made by senior police officers to counteract it? Ex-policemen, none at all that were apparent. Either they were unaware of it or that it existed, or they just chose to ignore it. The interviewer, amongst yourselves, when you talked about coloured people, what was the general attitude? The policeman, I suppose one of looking on them as inferior people. The interviewer, what sort of pressures are there on a policeman if he wants to do well at the job? Well, there is this sort of hard man cult which exists amongst the lower ranks, and this required a young man to prove himself in many ways. Mainly it requires him to prove himself on the number of arrests he makes. The interviewer, what about this in relation to coloured people? Are they more vulnerable? The ex-policeman, the old tradition would be that the coloured man is not fully aware of his rights as a white man would be. And on this assumption, I suppose he would be more vulnerable. The interviewer, how did you feel about it? The policeman, well, it's very difficult to preserve any individual views that one might have had at the outset. You get carried away along with the tide. Interviewer, did you ever feel like objecting? Policeman, well, naturally, one feels like objecting. I don't know, I can't speak for everyone, but I felt like objecting on a few occasions, but it would have been out of the question. It would have been socially unacceptable within the police force. So in here, Darcus outlines that this is what that first generation of migrants faced and the way that they felt that they could deal with it. So I myself belong to the generation that was politicized by Black Power, by the Black Power movement in the United States. And like many of the members of Race Today, I joined a Black Power organization in '71. And in '73, I became a member of the Race Today collective. In the Black movement, the landmark for us was the Mangrove Trial and the Mangrove Demonstration. And Brian hasn't mentioned that in this book, we have a wonderful piece by the radical lawyer, Gareth Peirce. And this is what she says in part of her piece. Two extraordinary political actions are firmly embedded in the history of 20th century British society. The trial of the Mangrove 9 in 1971 and the march 20,000 strong of Black Britons in 1981, both of which Darcus was at the helm. The Mangrove Demonstration and the trial success strengthened the Black Power movement as we took to the streets to campaign and demonstrate against police oppression in Black communities. And Darcus recalls in this book the sea change from what he calls the whisper in the ear of authority, going to MPs, going to politicians, saying we're being treated badly, please help us, please tell us, can you tell us what to do? To us taking the mantle ourselves and saying, we're not putting up with this, we've had enough, and we're taking to the streets and we're going to do something about it. And that trajectory is in this publication. So up and down the country in Black communities, there were different Black Power groups. And we had our own newspapers, Black Dimension, Black Voice, Grassroots, Freedom News, Harambee. And these newspapers were the voice really for these smallish organizations. I think in my organization, there were about 30 of us, but although we had a wider youth base of about 50. And we were always fighting against the police, and the campaigns that we had were against the framing of many, many Black people. One of the highlights was Joshua Francis, and this was a case that Darcus in the Brixton Black Panthers took up. Joshua was coming home from work, and I don't know, it isn't recorded what spurred the police to take the action they did, but they followed him home, beat him up in his home, and then framed him for the assault on 3 police officers. One of the other cases which the Brixton Black Panthers took up was the Oval 4, who were beaten and sentenced to 2 years in prison after attending a Black Panther meeting at Oval House. These were landmark cases for us, and we began to really feel our way as to how we were going to deal with the level of police oppression. Darcus, again in the book, just outlines the case of Joshua Francis and why it was important to us. So I'm just going to read a bit of that. He says, right. The campaign involved pickets of the courts, public demonstrations, public meetings, and the publication and disseminations of reams of leaflets. All Brixton knew about the Joshua Francis case. All Brixton, Black and white, was being introduced to a new and radical approach to a long-standing problem. The responses were by no means uniform. Young blacks were unreservedly for this new approach. Older West Indian workers expressed a caution, wait and see attitude, while offering a reserved sympathy. Working class whites were in the main skeptical, but by no means unalterably opposed. This approach was not confined to Brixton. In almost every black community in the country, groups emerged using the Panther organization as a model. So one of the things that we did in Race Today, because in those days, the wanton police practice was further reinforced by the attitudes of barristers, solicitors, who mainly told the defendants to plead guilty. And then by the time we got to court, the magistrates and judges would then just rubber stamp what the police had said. We challenged these practices and were overwhelmingly successful. And in Race Today, with an organization called the Black Parents and the Black Youth Movement, we developed a methodology which we used successfully to fight these cases. And this methodology was used in campaigns up and down the country. This effective strategy became a blueprint. First, the defendant had to be believed, and we had to allow them to determine their own strategy. Secondly, we had to assert the right to self-defense. And with the support of radical barristers and solicitors like Ian MacDonald, Mike Mansfield, Gareth Pearce, Len Woodley, Ben Burberg, we employed this effective strategy in cases. And being a member of Race Today, I have to tell you, there was not a week that went by where we weren't involved in some campaign or the other. And I've got a small list here for you, and I'm hoping some of my comrades from Race Today are listening to this because they will remember many of them. George Lindo, Jackie Barclay, Cliff McDaniel, the Thornton Heath 7, the Brockwell 3, the Harlesden 8, the Dallow 7, the Luton 3, the Arndale 2, the Wood Green 26, the East End campaigns against the National Front, where the Asian community armed itself and they were then promptly arrested. And as Brian talked about, the Bradford 12, where Asians who were told the NF were going to march through Manningham decided that they would arm themselves and defend themselves against the NF. And of course, they were arrested, but again, pleaded self-defense is no offense and was successful in winning their campaigns. We campaigned hugely against the SAS laws, and we know this culminated in Operation Swamp, the anniversary of the Brixton uprising against Operation Swamp being April the 11th, 1981, 39 years ago, as Brian has said, and we're going to celebrate the 40-year anniversary of that uprising and the Black People's Day of Action next year, I'm sure. Darcus himself spent 10 years on bail as the authorities attempted to curb his political activity. He was arrested 6 times, and on one occasion, it was that he was not allowed within a mile of the offices of Race Today. And of course, if anybody knows Darcus or knows now the mythology of Darcus, you will know that when we were having a defense meeting to discuss how we would defend him against this latest case, where he was not allowed to be part of the meeting because of the curfew that the police had imposed upon him, he walked straight into the offices and says, I'm the defendant and I'll determine how my case is going to be done. To which, you know, there was a lot of, oh, but we all had to concede that Darcus was present, breaking his bail conditions, and we had to take whatever the consequences were. Of course, our biggest campaign was when Darcus was arrested and imprisoned for 3 months. And this was after he defended himself at a tube station after a day of cricket. And at those days, you didn't have to walk through the barriers. You could walk past the ticket collector. Some altercation took place between him and the ticket collector. A barrister, white barrister, didn't like what he saw and came up and assaulted or attempted to assault Darcus with his umbrella. And Darcus, I think, knocked him to the ground. So we went to court, and I'll never forget, it was at Knightsbridge. And we were like pretty confident and cocky in Race Today at this time. I mean, we were going for it big time. We had had so much success in our political campaigns, not only against the police, but in the strikes that we had supported in Imperial Typewriter and in strikes up and down the country. We were producing a magazine. We had international support. We were like a center really for radical activity. So Darcus going to Knightsbridge and defending himself against this this assault for us was no big deal. So when the judge said he was sending him to prison for 3 months, you can imagine the utter horror all of us had when we realized, in fact, we had lost. So a lesson to all of us when we kind of think we're where it's at. I got a message to visit Darcus in jail, and the message was take him some brandy. And in those days, you could do those sorts of things. There was nothing like the security. So I hid some brandy under my arm and went in and saw him in jail. And of course, I was very distressed. I was, I wouldn't say I was crying, but it was very distressing to see him in his Pentonville blues, sitting behind a desk. And Darcus Howe was in jail. I mean, this was really quite unimaginable for us. And he just looked at me and just said, you know what you have to do. You know what you all have to do. The collective knows what it has to do. We've done it for many people. You have to do it now for me. We have to raise an international campaign. I took some notes there and then as to internationally who the people were, went back to the collective, and we formed a defense committee. And as Brian has said, we were successful in getting Darcus out of jail within a week. He tells the story of being in jail, and when the wardens came to take him to the appeal court, which of course was in the Strand, they said to him, you're not coming back here. It had already been decided that Darcus wouldn't be coming back. So this is something when you're when you're part of a movement in an organization that can achieve and can win victories. And it does a lot for you, for your confidence and your understanding. And the book really captures our combative spirit and the way that we felt. I think the book also is quite poignant because it reminds us of what we lack now that Darcus isn't here. His intellect, his analysis, his historical approach, and above all, his fearlessness and courage. I mean, Darcus never, ever conceded, ever, not to stand up for his beliefs. I think Brian has said that this book, in conjunction with his biography, written by Robin Bunce and Paul Field, the anthology, Here to Stay, Here to Fight, are now kind of 3 books which we are really pleased are able to capture an era that has gone. I mean, it's an era now 40 years ago. It's history, it's contemporary history. But we're so pleased in book form that we're able to do it. We're hoping to be able to do this in other forms as we go forward. But it is a timely reminder, I think, of the progress that the Black community has made in this country, particularly in these times when, once again, we're faced with us being affected in a way disproportionately more than white people, and people not coming up with real answers as to why this is or what we should do, or giving people strength when they're asked to go on walls without proper protection to say no. And this is what this book reminds us of, that it's possible to say no, to stand up for yourself and to win. And I think that I just want to say that the important thing about all of this is that this history is being told by the people who participated in it themselves. It's not sociology. It's not a political person putting their stance on it. These publications, all of them, tell it from the standpoint of the people who were active in that moment. And it's a history that I hope, as time goes on, will be revered. Darcus will be revered, and more people will get to understand his work and the work of the collective. Thank you.
Amazing, fantastic. Thank you very much for that, Layla. Thank you for giving us insight into the amazing legacy, into the fearlessness and courage of Darcus Howe. I'd just like to open up the floor for some questions. We've already got some questions. If you want to, I just want to remind everybody that if you want to ask a question or add a contribution, that the Bookmarks live stream comment section, please put your contributions or questions there. Just going to start off with the first few questions. Okay, so we have one from Alex, who's a mental health worker, and asks if Black people presenting with mental health problems Alex, who is a mental health worker, asks, Black people presenting with mental health problems express mistrust of the police still. Is this a common finding in the criminal justice system? Okay, that's the first question. The second question is, racism is still very much, Josh asks, racism is still very much inherent in the policing system, but also across all institutions. How can people effectively write the legacy of racism and racism in the police today? And then Tim asks, can you say something about the British Black Panther movement? How successful was it in building a presence in the UK? And could you also say something about the role of the Notting Hill Carnival in establishing a Black cultural presence in Britain and the recent attempts to dilute its politics? Yes. And Joe says, please include the story about the time Marcus performed a citizen's arrest on a drunken police officer and gave him a cup of tea and a sandwich. Yeah, that's all. I'll just open up the floor.
Okay, I mean, these are huge questions. I'm going to ask Brian for help, but I can start with the story which I didn't include because I had done it at the previous launch, and I'm going to tell it really as Darcus would love to tell it. It was the Queen's Jubilee, and normally the British population would celebrate. Well, they did celebrate this with sausage rolls, Scotch eggs, sandwiches, and you had tables with tablecloths. And you had street parties, and everybody would gather and talk. And the Mangrove decided that they would celebrate, the Mangrove restaurant and the community centre decided that they would celebrate the Jubilee by having Africa Liberation Day. So the Mangrove had all the African liberation flags. And at that time, the countries fighting for liberation were Mozambique, Angola, Guinea-Bissau, South Africa, of course. And so they had all these flags out, and they decided that for their Jubilee, it would be a celebration of African liberation. They arranged for some of the good ice cream to come down, Marine Ices, those who are old enough to remember Marine Ices, and they had their party. Frank and Darcus had been to the police and had told them that they were going to have this party, that they'd be celebrating Africa Liberation Day outside the Mangrove on All Saints Road, and so it was done with police permission. During the course of the party, some police officers turned up in a car and they were drunk, and they became very abusive, particularly to Frank. And I think over the Mangrove, and if people read about the Mangrove, they would know the importance of Frank Critchlow, who was the restaurant owner, very abusive to Frank and to Darcus. And so Darcus pulled one of the police officers out of the car, who turned out to be an inspector called Inspector Hunt, and gave a citizen's arrest. Now, these days you don't hear about citizen's arrest, but at that era, there was a period of you could arrest somebody as a citizen if you felt they were breaking the law. So Darcus did a citizen's arrest on Inspector Hunt and took him to the basement of the Mangrove and arrested him and locked him in the basement of the Mangrove. He had a friend there called Wappy King, and he said to Wappy, we've got a prisoner in the basement and we're going to do what the police do with all prisoners. We're going to give him a cup of tea and a sandwich. So Wappy King made him a cup of tea and a sandwich. Darcus then contacts Scotland Yard and says that he's carried out a citizen's arrest on Inspector Hunt, who was abusive at the party. And again, part of our confidence at the time, thought, well, he's carried out a citizen's arrest. One or two officers would come down and discuss with Darcus and get Inspector Hunt released and find out what the issues were. Well, what happened was that van loads of policemen, the big green lorries, which you don't see now, of police officers came, charged the Mangrove, arrested Darcus, and Darcus was charged with kidnapping. Anyway, this is one of the 6 cases of when we've had to fight campaigns to get Darcus out of the police hands. So it went on for a while, for over a year, with different motions being put. And finally, I think the kidnapping charge was dropped, and I think it might have been obstruction or something. But anyway, Darcus was found not guilty. And when the case ended, the magistrate looked at him and said, Darcus, next time I suggest you don't have any conversations with the police. So that's the story. In terms of some of the other questions, I was not a member of the Black Panther movement. And I don't know if, I don't think that the people who are viewing this have the ability to speak about it. But I wasn't in the Panthers. I was in something called the Black Unity and Freedom Party. but we knew of the Panthers, and the Panthers was probably the largest Black organization. It was very large in Brixton. In the Brixton Black Panthers was a very large organization. When they had their gatherings at Oval House, they would have hundreds of people who would come to their cultural events. Farouk was a member of the Brixton Black Panthers, Farouk Dondi, and they also had a branch in North London. They produced Freedom News, and their leader was Althea Lequant, a woman a tremendous orator and intellectual person who was able to encapsulate the Black struggle at that time. But in terms of what it was like to be in the Panthers, I don't know. I can only talk about its impact, and its impact was huge at that time. It was the largest Black organization in Britain. On Notting Hill Carnival, well, the struggle for Notting Hill Carnival, which is something which Darkers and the Race Today Collective, together with carnivalists in Notting Hill, had campaigned for over, a decade. One, to keep Carnival on the streets. So the first campaigns against Carnival were that it shouldn't be in Notting Hill at all. So there was a commander called Patterson who went around all the local community and got a huge petition signed to say that the residents of Notting Hill didn't want Carnival on the streets. So there was the fight to keep Carnival on the streets. There was the fight to make Carnival be accepted as an artistic form equal to, say, the ballet, the opera, to the theatre. So there was that fight as well, which we were part of. I myself took part in many campaigns and pickets outside the Arts Council, demanding that Carnival be accepted as a legitimate art form as any of the other art forms in Britain. And then the other fight for Carnival was the police, because year on year, the policing of Carnival increased until I think it was the Battle of Carnival, I think in '74, where the youth fought pitch battle with the police in order to maintain their right to keep it on the road. And so that is also documented, the battle to keep Carnival on the streets of Notting Hill, to keep it as an art form, and to try and keep its at that time there was a fight to keep it as a democratic organisation, that the people who should determine how Carnival was organised should be the steel pan players, the mass players and the sound systems, and they should be the ones who carried out the negotiations with the authorities and with the police for the route and what should happen with Carnival. And I think that has changed somewhat now. Brian, I'm going to ask you to answer some of the other questions.
Sure. Well, firstly, I think Alex's question, the answer, the very short and simple answer to Alex's question is, yes, it is still a problem, certainly, and particularly for people with mental health issues, but I think it's more broadly concerns about the police and distrust in the police is a common experience amongst people from Black, Asian and minority ethnic communities. And it's not surprising that that's the case. It was just a few years ago, wasn't it, that a report that Theresa May herself commissioned when she was Home Secretary exposed the fact that on that critical issue of stops and search, you are disproportionately more likely still to be stopped and searched. At the time of the Stephen Lawrence inquiry, it was something like you were 4 times more likely to be stopped and searched, despite the conclusions and recommendations of Macpherson's inquiry and report. Today, you are still just as likely as you were back then to be stopped and searched. And under certain police provisions, you are something like 60 times more likely to be stopped and searched. But as David Lammy's report in 2017 into the criminal justice system exposed, far more likely to be charged, far more likely to be taken to court, interestingly, actually, less likely to be convicted of certain offences, which highlights the fact that you're more likely to have been fitted up for offences that you hadn't committed in the first place. But if you are convicted, you're much more likely to be sentenced to prison and sentenced to prison for longer. That is our experience at the hands of the police and criminal justice system. It's an indication of the institutional racism and is a justifiable reason why there continues to be mistrust. And I think it kind of leads on to the next question about what can be done to right the legacy, because it is important to talk, as Layla did, about progress having been made. Because if you didn't recognize any progress and you didn't see any progress happening, the temptation would be to think that nothing can ever change and that there's nothing that we can do apart from isolate ourselves in our homes, as we're having to do at the moment, and just hope, pray or whatever that at some point things will get better. But if you think about, for example, the fact that with the Lawrence report, Macpherson had to recognise institutional racism in the way in which Scarman didn't, as Darcus shows in the book. The reason why Macpherson was forced to draw that conclusion was precisely because people fought for and campaigned that the inquiry itself, it wasn't simply that this old retired judge somehow came up with the idea of institutional racism out of his head. It was because people from the community, firstly, the inquiry itself happened because the Lawrence family and their supporters fought for it. And that was a legacy of people, black and white, up and down the country, in their communities, in their trade union branches, fighting to support the campaign. The Lawrences themselves said the reason they were able to keep their campaign going from the point of Stephen's death in '93 right the way through to the inquiry and beyond. The inquiry was in 1998 and was published in '99. The reason they were able to keep going was because their campaign was underwritten by the trade union movement. And that was because people came together and organised and struggled. And that, of course, is the kind of legacy of movements like the movements that Darcus was involved in. And I think it provides us with the kinds of lessons that we need to implement today. You think about what's happening at the moment under the coronavirus crisis. Why is it, that there are lessons that are going to need to be learned about disproportionality and so on. But think about things like, for example, the fact that the buses are now saying that the front doors are going to be closed and that people have to enter via the middle doors, and they're not having to pay their fares. That didn't come about because the bosses of the bus companies, or indeed because the mayor, Sadiq Khan, said that that should happen. That happened because bus drivers took action themselves and said, we are not going to allow our lives to continue to be put at risk more than they already are. I mean, too many of them have died already, but they have said, we are going to take action ourselves. And that, I think, is a critically important lesson that we have to learn. One of the lessons that you learn in From Bobby to Babylon, and one of the lessons that we are going to have to take forward. Not relying upon the authorities, not relying upon the police to transform themselves, but doing things ourselves. I also, just on the question of Notting Hill, interestingly, the front cover of From Bobby to Babylon is an image of the community and the police at Notting Hill. And it really highlights, doesn't it, the difference between the joyous crowd of people reveling and the police who hated carnival. My first ever carnival was 1976, and I remember the horror we experienced. I was just a very young kid at the time. The horror of being chased and harassed by the police at that time. They hated the multiculturalism, they hated the celebration that carnival represented, and efforts were made for decades that continue to this day to try and make carnival a much less political affair. Fortunately, in the last couple of years, there has been, through, for example, Love Music, Hate Racism, working in conjunction with Smokey Joe, one of the people who runs one of the road shows on Carnival, there has been an attempt, quite successful, to re-inject the kind of spirit that people like Darcus brought to Carnival, a sense not just of celebration, but of organisation and struggle. And I think these are lessons that we need to learn and continue to implement today.
Okay. So for me, I'm just going to read the last few words in Darcus's own introduction. He says, in the last couple of years, a new generation of young Black activists has emerged. If these articles serve to educate them that their struggles are based in a solid historical foundation, then I consider the hours and days spent writing them to be of some use. Darcus Howe, January 1988.
Well, I'm going to finish by saying that, of course, as I tried to say in my opening remarks, that this is not just a book of nostalgia, but it's a book that can help to teach us lessons that we need to implement today. And there are things that we can and must do right now, even in our isolation. Next Tuesday, for example, is Workers' Memorial Day, and there will be socially distant, appropriate protests to remember all of those people who've died, which is carrying out the work that they do. I think it's particularly important this year in the circumstances that we're living in, that those kinds of protests continue. And the slogan of those protests is to remember the dead, but to fight for the living. That, I'm sure, is that's the kind of sentiment that shines out of this book. And it's the kind of sentiment I think we need to carry into what we do in the next few days and into the future. In the meantime, stay safe, my friends. Thank you for joining us.
Stay safe, everybody. Thank you.
Okay, amazing talk. Unfortunately, we won't be able to answer any more questions, but thank you very much, Brian and Layla. And please, another reminder, please pick up the book From Bobby to Babylon, which is available at Bookmarks, which do home delivery. Yes, it's so you can buy it on Bookmarks online. I think it's about £8.50 with £2.50 delivery, I believe. Yeah, sorry, £8 with £8.50 for the book, and for postage, it's £2.50. So please pick up the book, and thank you very much for everybody for coming. But we're gonna have to close this meeting. Thank you very much, Brian. Thank you very much, Layla.
Thank you. Bye.
Everybody, be safe and have a wonderful evening. Okay.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Ola. Thank you, Layla. That was fantastic as ever.
Was that okay?
I'm glad that Jay made you tell the story.